This video will stay a black screen for its entire duration. Feel free to close your eyes and listen to my story. Only 42 seconds until Charlie was free. Finishing his last couple words for the day, Charlie could barely pay attention to what he was typing as he was too focused on the clock. This was the least interesting news week he'd seen in a long time. He had barely written anything all day. 37 seconds. Charlie knew he should at least try to finish this page before work tomorrow. It wasn't due yet, but it'd be better to get this out of the way so he wouldn't have a problem scrambling to do it later. 24 seconds. Charlie thought about which words to use to finish his next sentence, and his mind drew a blank. 19 seconds. He sat and stared at the page. 13 seconds. He took a deep breath. 9 seconds. He thought of an opening. 4 seconds. That was all Charlie wrote before the clock struck 7. It was time to go home. Charlie gets home and stares at his surroundings before he makes it through the door. As per usual, it was the same low saturated walls that he was greeted by. He made his way through his bland hallway, each step feeling heavier than the last. Tacky furniture adorned his living room. The most interesting thing in the room was his TV. He flopped on his couch and began watching whatever the first thing to catch his eye was. A cheesy horror movie, likely from quite a few years back. It didn't scare him. He could tell none of the actors cared about anything going on in their movie. No one cared. If anything, it comforted him. It's not like he didn't want to care. He just couldn't find a reason to. His therapist told him he needs to find something of value to put his heart into, but there just weren't many options. He did think fondly of one of her suggestions, though. You're a writer, right? Just write about your day, but make it more interesting. Make things up. Write about a life you wish you could live. She was so peppy, he couldn't understand it, but he was inspired by her charisma for sure. He tried to focus on the movie a bit more. It was so bad. Screw it. He had made up his mind. He wasn't going to sit there and waste away the night. He hadn't done enough writing at work, and more importantly, this terrible movie fueled him with enough spite to try and write something far scarier. He'll take his therapist's advice and write his day as a horror movie. The cheesy horror movie used some awful CGI turtle monster. He knew the first thing he needed was a concept for his monster, one much better than a turtle. If this was about his day, he figured he could get a bit surreal. The Boredom Monster. The name was simple, which made it more effective since it had to be boring to some extent. Charlie had the concept in mind. He turned off his television and went to his computer to see what he could come up with for the story. Most of it was meant to be about his day anyways. It couldn't be too hard to figure out a plotline. He just had to make it scary. He started with the basics, starting at nighttime, setting the mood ominously as one does. He wasn't great at scenery, but he made do. He tried getting creative. Charlie knew he wanted it to rain, but where most scary stories would make it pour, he just wanted it raining softly. It would keep things boring. The rain was a light drizzle, the perfect white noise. Before he could go any further, the pitter-patter of drops echoed on the window pane. To Charlie, this was just a coincidence. It just happened to be raining, nothing more to it. Of course, it would start as light rain. Rain gets heavier as time moves forward. He wrote of thunder and lightning. As he thought of what to write next, lightning struck and thunder boomed. This caught his attention. He paused for a second. That was eerie to him. Now he had to test something. He wrote that the sky ruptured, a noise that sounded like thunder, but it was actually the roar of the Boredom Monster. He paused before writing any further, and sure enough, the exact noise he had envisioned was heard, about half a mile from his house. Charlie took a step back from his computer, convinced that he's going insane. None of this could be real, right? This was just thunder that he heard. The thunder got closer, it's meant to do that, but no lightning struck. Maybe it happened when he blinked? Charlie jumped back to his computer, determined to prove to himself that he hadn't lost his sanity. His frail fingers typed away furiously. He wrote of wind howling, and the wind got louder. He wrote of rustling outside his yard, and sure enough, he had heard that as well. At this point, he had to think to himself, there's a good chance he was just imagining all this. It was very likely that he was, but even if he wasn't, this filled him with adrenaline. For the first time in a long time, he had a story on his hands that got him thinking. He felt like a person for once instead of a husk. None of it was real. It couldn't be real. So this urge he felt to keep writing was fine, right? Charlie decides to really see how far he can push this. A light scratching can be heard outside the walls as if something was trying to break in. Charlie's head darts to the right as he hears something stroke his wall with what could only be assumed to be long, sharp claws. Again, he's just hearing things. This was just his imagination going wild, right? Any inspired writer would have these kinds of reactions to a story they find themselves passionate about. He took it a step further. Footsteps. Heavy, uncalculated footsteps. His adrenaline had convinced him that wasn't enough. He added the sound of the door to his room opening. Just as he thought he'd finally written something truly impossible, he heard a booming presence outside by the scratched wall, moving closer to the door. His pupils dilated as the door behind him creaked open. He didn't dare turn around. A giant looming shadow appeared right behind him. That's a detail he didn't write. There was something in the room with him now. He was convinced. Charlie sat, breathing, not moving a muscle. If he wrote the wrong thing, it'd be the last thing he'd ever write. He needed to get out of this situation. He had to end the story now, whether he liked it or not. He wasn't willing to tempt fate anymore. Charlie wrote, and then the monster went away, the story was over, and everything was okay. The end. Maybe whatever was in the room with him would go away. But the shadow didn't go away. He was engulfed in it now, and had no other options. Charlie had to turn around and face the boredom monster. Praying for a miracle, he spun around, eyes closed, and screamed, throwing punches wildly with no other options of self-defense. But the punches hit nothing. Charlie stopped throwing his fists and opened his eyes. There was nothing in the room with him. The door had closed without making a sound, if it was ever even open to begin with. Charlie caught his breath, staring at the door, then his computer, rinse and repeat, trying to comprehend the situation. It was all so palpable just a moment ago. Maybe an hour passed before he came to any kind of conclusion. Was nothing there? Charlie couldn't figure that out right now. It was way too late, and he had work in the morning. Despite his exhaustion, Charlie barely slept that night, trying to figure out how he would explain this all to his therapist.